What's up, everybody? This is Chapter 9 of Svetozar Stojanović, Between Ideals and Reality, a Critique of Socialism and its Future. Chapter 9 is titled Revolutionary Teleology and Ethics. Let's rock. Section 1. Can dictatorship lead to democracy? Coercion and violence to freedom. Class struggle to classless society. Can uniformity yield diversity? Shall we expect absolute state power to usher in a society without a state, a self-governing community? How can socialist revolution, itself a part of prehistory, lead to the beginning of mankind's true history? Can the revolutionary himself belong to the old world, create a new life, and educate the new man? Who is to educate the educators? The relationship between revolutionary ends and means has always presented Marxists and communists with a considerable cause for concern, while being a matter of interest to Marxologists and students of communism as well. Any serious consideration of the ethical dimensions of the socialist revolution would be impossible without these categories. To illustrate the problem, I shall cite a few examples, perhaps the best of which are the celebrated polemics, to which we shall return later, between Kautsky on the one hand and Lenin and Trotsky on the other, and nearly 20 years later between Trotsky and John Dewey. In his Humanism and Terror, published in 1947, Merleau-Ponty discussed a central aspect of revolutionary teleology. Recently, Marcuse published a very interesting essay on ethics and revolution. Sartre's great drama, Le Maine Salle, masterfully elaborates the crucifixion of the communist movement between ends and means. Were we to present just a few communists with the choice between Sartre's Oderer and Hugo, their decisions would manifest some fundamentally different sympathies and orientations. Contemporary Marxism's struggle with Stalinism is also largely centered upon the ends-means relationship. Of all the communist movement's failures under Stalinism, none has been more distressing than its moral failure, as this had been a movement which had undertaken a highly ambitious moral venture. It was demonstrated that people can so degrade their unlimited faith in their historical mission that they will use any means necessary in order to realize it. The communist movement has often been torn between the most human of ends and the most brutal of means. Revolution itself is a vehicle of moral temptation. Revolutionary goals and actions, by definition, negate the existing moral, political, cultural, and legal value normative order. What kind of considerations are there, then, to prevent revolutionaries from falling prey to complete moral relativism? Surely life itself, not to mention revolution, generates a kind of moral tragedy. It is often the case that one must choose between the greater or lesser evil, instead of choosing between the greater or lesser good. The quote ledger of life never consists solely of moral gains, but there can still be life histories in which moral gains far outweigh moral losses. The revolutionary must take great care not to identify explanation of his mistakes by referring to the difficulty of the situation in which he committed them with their vindication. If he gets used to making this kind of identification, his final moral balance will certainly be negative. Section 2. In the history of the communist movement, it has been very rare that anyone has had the courage to openly proclaim the principle that the end justifies the means. Not even Stalin himself went that far. One of the reasons for this was probably Marx's repeated assertion that, quote, the end which requires bad means is not a good end, end quote. But while it may not have been professed, this principle is frequently applied in practice. There are few political movements which have not proclaimed their good intentions. At first, all communists are in agreement over the ultimate humanistic goals of their movement, but the movement's real character cannot be evaluated solely on the basis of its programmatic ends. Its real activity, i.e., the means it employs, must also be taken into account. If one were to limit oneself to consideration of ultimate goals, the revolutionary movement's program would sound quite abstract, undefined and rather undifferentiated from other humanistic programs. It is generally recognized that the ends-means relationship has a dialectical character. Each member of the relationship can be concretized only in connection with the other. Not only are the means chosen in accordance with the end's true nature is also fully revealed only in the means chosen and employed. The degree of concern for the end is directly proportional to the degree of concern for the means, for the harmonious balance of end and means. In contrast to Marxist, concrete, and revolutionary humanism, abstract humanism neglects to consider means, real conditions and possibilities and necessary phases. Thus the latter is often reduced either to rhetoric or to a noble but sterile utopia. Examination of means often reveals a disproportion between conscious ends and the subconscious ends which are really desired. Where there is strong disagreement over the choice of means to the same end, one should immediately strongly suspect the existence of hidden differences with respect to the end itself. What we really desire is not manifest in what we say we desire, but rather in the manner in which our true goal actually obligates us to act. The end ought to be the constitutive as well as the regulative principle of the means. Causa finalis must be operative in causa efficiens. What else is realization of the end but the application of means? Thus, individual elements of the end must develop from the very first. Otherwise, the means will realize some other end than the one originally intended, while the initial end will remain in thought or in words only. The end can morally justify the means only if the means do not morally disqualify the end. Not only must the means be constantly controlled by the end, the reverse must apply as well. In choosing its goal, the revolutionary movement must establish the cost it will pay in order to achieve it. Decisions about a goal can be made intelligently and responsibly only when other goals and an evaluation of all the consequences of planned means are taken into consideration. Foul means cannot lead to a moral end, and even if they could, they would still not be justified. As soon as such means are employed, a gap immediately opens between the proclaimed end and the one that is actually realized, as immoral means always have unintended as well as intended consequences. The end can be defined as the ensemble of intended consequences which respond to our needs. An action's value is given by all of its consequences, as well as by its intended end. Thus, in order to evaluate the praxis of the revolutionary movement, one should establish all the consequences which followed from the given course of action, and distinguish between those consequences that were predictable and those that were not, and hold the movement responsible for all the consequences that were predictable, and not merely for those that were intended. The ensemble of predictable consequences may in some cases far outweigh those that were intended, i.e. the end. In an ethical comparison, the ethics of intentions, the ethics of ultimate ends, is much too narrow to embrace everything which is de facto morally relevant in human behavior. In a certain sense, the revolutionary movement is the totality of revolutionary means which have been set into motion. It must therefore continuously examine all revolutionary means in order to adapt them to the humanistic nature of its ends. Humanism is not merely a transcendent ideal. Humanism is also an inherited store of values which creates lasting obligations for the revolutionary movement. Footnote: one can textually prove that G.L. Klein, in his paper, quote, "Was Marx an ethical humanist?" unquote, was wrong when he proclaimed Marx to have been exclusively a, quote, humanist of ideals, unquote, or of the future, rather than a, quote, humanist of principles, unquote, or of the present. I have already referred to a passage from Marx concerning ends and means which speaks against Klein's interpretation. In Klein's interpretation, the sole intrinsic value for Marx was the man of the future, the member of classless society. Klein then finds it very easy to conclude that Marx's humanism, which in his view was only apparent and not true humanism, allegedly led naturally to Stalinism. End footnote. In the absence of continuity between ends and means, it would be impossible to maintain the humanistic continuity of the revolution. The need for ideological rationalization increases with the brutality of the means employed. It is hard to find a better illustration of this than Stalin's propaganda statement about the humaneness of the Soviet Constitution, which was adopted during the bloodiest stages of the purges. A central role in the structure of this rationalization was played by the idea that in extremely unfavorable conditions the movement was compelled the movement was compelled to utilize all means in order to ensure the realization of the movement's revolutionary humanistic goals. Stalin also gave Churchill this kind of explanation of the bloody collectivization of the countryside, quote, all that was painful and difficult but necessary, end quote. Theoretically, such rationalization proceeds from a purely transcendentalist and futurist interpretation of revolutionary ideals and goals. It proceeds namely from the idea that the use of the most brutal means will lead to a future which will be characterized solely by human means. This is merely a technique for relieving oneself of the burden of historical ethical responsibility and transferring it to existing conditions and circumstances to historical necessity. There are several stages in the psychological process of employing immoral means. At first, there is an absence of awareness of the moral disproportion between end and means. Next, there is a feeling of anxiety over this disproportion. Only at this point does one resort privately to the rationalization that the end justifies the means. For its part, rationalization accelerates the inversion of ends and means, a process we shall call the finalization of means and the instrumentalization of ends. The finalization of means and the instrumentalization of ends. So long as immoral means are used to justify humanistic ends, the former increasingly replace the latter. This process starts at the idea that existing conditions did not permit scruples in choosing the means, and with the sincere belief that such immoral means will be renounced as soon as the situation becomes more favorable. And it concludes at the point where it is too late for this ethical transformation, as in the meantime the revolutionaries themselves have changed, become corrupt, and for them the means have become transformed into ends. With Stalinism, the store of original goals for which the revolutionaries had lived became transformed into a form of ideological, false consciousness which now merely conceals their true goals from others as well as from themselves. Section 3. The more ambitious the goals of the revolution, the more difficult it is to guarantee effective means for their realization. The more costly the means, the greater is the danger the means will become ends in themselves, and thus bring both the revolutionaries and their goals under their control. In such circumstances, there is an exaggerated interest in revolutionary means, almost to the point of obsession, from which it is only a short step to the inversion of ends and means. I am speaking of the paradox of revolutionary means. Human activity and organization, even if conceived as a means, tend to emancipate themselves from their own ends and even replace them. I am speaking of the paradox of revolutionary means. Human activity and organization, even if conceived as a means, tend to emancipate themselves from their own ends and even replace them. The means quickly begin to take on their own rhythm and direction, creating a gap between themselves and the ends which they were to serve. The emancipation of means is made all the easier by the fact that means ontologically precede ends, and not vice versa. Although conceived and selected in accordance with ends, means exist completely independently of them, while ends, even in the process of their realization, are largely ends in view, and exist only in consciousness. The revolutionary movement's problem is not so much that the revolutionaries' ambitious goals meet with unexpectedly strong resistance from reality, but rather that it can come to prefer its organizations, activities, and institutions, which it had originally conceived only as revolutionary means, to its goals. Revolutionary goals can be threatened not only by real conditions, but sometimes even more by the revolutionary means employed. Thus, breaking with the past in the name of radical goals often turns out most unradically. The revolutionary movement absolutizes itself and thereby creates a great historical illusion. As a rule, this is a factor which the revolutionary movement fails to take into account in trying to anticipate the outcome of its revolutionary efforts. This failure has been responsible for the fact that many revolutions, instead of being defeated at the hands of their enemies, had defeated themselves. The emancipation of revolutionary means and their finalization is a form of alienation. Revolutionary activity and its creations escape the control of the revolutionaries and begin to rule over them. Unfortunately, it is usually only when the process of finalization of revolutionary means and instrumentalization of revolutionary ends is already well advanced that the revolutionaries begin to take note of it. Perhaps the most appalling thing of them all for them is to discover that their movement is creating the same kind of evil that characterized the world against which they rebelled. This discovery leads them either to disillusionment or rationalization, or less frequently to revolt. Those who choose the last alternative are as a rule eliminated politically and at times even physically. As for the others, they are not capable of living and acting for long with an awareness of the gap between their own words, their goals, and their deeds, the means. Thus they usually come to believe once again in the essential harmony of verbal and actual revolutionary teleology and convince themselves that this is essentially in harmony with revolutionary ethics. The most obvious departures from proclaimed goals are most commonly justified as necessary and temporary, albeit unfortunate, means. In ideology, means are even further relativized with respect to revolutionary goals, while in practice they are finalized. The concept of the, quote, transitional period, unquote, becomes more than welcome as a basis for rationalization. For many, this period makes temporary ethical unscrupulousness permissible. But in fact, socialism must immediately begin to realize elements of communism, which is after all the period to which the transitional period ought to lead. It would seem that the theory of the unconscious would be applied more broadly than it has been, to include revolutionary groups as well. The phenomenon of the inversion of ends and means leads one to suspect that from the very first, there were subconscious goals underlying the conscious goals, and the great differences existed between them. The conscious goals centered upon a society without classes or a state. In circumstances like these, only serve to conceal the movement's subconscious desire to absolutize itself once it achieves power. Individual Marxists have also contributed to this tendency, albeit unintentionally, by giving simplified and ultimately vague definitions of the goal of socialist revolution, which in their view is the seizure of power. The degeneration of the Communist Party, if and when it comes to pass, is usually disguised by invoking the ultimate goals of the revolution. Social democracy, however, usually openly abandons the original goals of the workers' movement and concentrates social democracy's entire effort upon what were formerly only means. There is no more straightforward statement than Bernstein's, quote, "The movement is everything, the goal nothing," end quote. Thus, where the positivist interpretation of Marxism has prevailed, as in the workers' parties of the Second International, the original revolutionary humanist goals have disappeared almost without a trace. The function of rationalization in this case was fulfilled by the notion of, quote, political realism, end quote. Thus, while Stalinists pervert the movement's original goals, opportunists simply ignore them altogether. The results are ultimately the same: complete absorption in political means and their finalization. But while with opportunists this process culminates before they ever come to power, with Stalinists it begins largely after power has already been seized. Thus for degenerated communists as well, although only implicitly, the movement is everything and the goal nothing, it turns out that their ultimate subconscious goal is the same as that of the opportunists: to hold power. It is interesting that the utopian humanism of the revolutionary may also lead to a finalization of means. In this context, utopianism may be taken to denote an exaggerated fixation upon ends chosen independently of the existence of adequate means. The emancipation, alienation, and tyranny of means are frequent results of utopianism. When his goals come into irreconcilable conflict with reality, the revolutionary is often rendered passive and may even turn to nihilism, or he may even obstinately attempt to impose his ideals upon reality. Of course, there is also a third possibility. He may correct the unrealistic aspects of his goals and still not sacrifice the basic content of the humanistic program. An organization which stubbornly tries to realize utopian goals is driven to the pursuit of politics at any cost. The more difficult it finds the goals to achieve, the more terrible will be the means which it will employ. And conversely, the more brutal the means, the more organization must invoke exceptional ends. Thus the degenerated utopian resorts to ultra-leftist fanaticism and thereby does violence to real historical possibilities. Section 4. The central element of the entire process of finalization of revolutionary means is the finalization of the revolutionary organization itself. This is accompanied by finalization of the revolutionary state and of revolutionary violence, economic and technical development, planning, and so on. In the next two sections, I shall devote my attention to the finalization of the revolutionary organization and to revolutionary violence. The working class in Tsarist Russia was very small. In Marxist terms, this meant that one of the necessary preconditions for socialist revolution was absent. Thus, instead of the class, the main protagonist of the socialist revolution was an even narrower social group, the Communist Party. But the principle of party nost, quote, party-mindedness, end quote, even more than that of, quote, class-mindedness, end quote, is double-edged. Party-mindedness can pertain either to a party-mindedness which aspires to the universal human principle, or to a party-mindedness which is confined to the party itself. Is party-mindedness to be interpreted as openness and broad-mindedness, or as exclusiveness and sectarianism? In a certain sense, this question involves the principal danger confronting the revolutionary vanguard in the revolutionary vanguard's effort to realize its historical mission. Unless it possesses extraordinary moral strength, the vanguard cannot avoid falling prey to the temptation concealed in one side of this dilemma. Its mission is characterized by the tension as well as the unity inherent in the dialectic of party, class, and universal human principles. For Marxists, the revolutionary vanguard is the mediator between the working class's immediate interest and the working class's historical interest. The latter, by assumption, being in harmony with universal human interest, and between the working class, quote, in itself and, quote, for itself. But there is the possibility that the revolutionary organization may exploit its role as advocate of general and future interest to the advantage of the revolutionary organization's own oligarchic interest. This becomes even more likely than the working class comprised only a small minority of the population. One of the basic paradoxes of the communist movement in such conditions arises because the revolutionary vanguard tries to interpret the interests of a class for whose development it is only creating the preconditions. One of the basic paradoxes of the communist movement in such conditions arises from the because the revolutionary vanguard tries to interpret the interests of a class for whose development is only creating the preconditions. The otherwise justified distinction between the historical and immediate interests of the working class makes it possible for the party to jeopardize that class's real interest while vindicating itself by invoking the class's historical interest. While social democracy's basic failure has been the opportunistic neglect of the working class's historical interest in the name of its immediate interest, the Stalinized communist parties have failed precisely in the opposite, ultra-leftist, or more accurately, pseudo-leftist direction. They have realized a total monopoly of social power in which any possibility of legal influence upon them is completely absent, and in which even the possibilities of covert political influence, not to mention political pressure, are very minute. The Communist Party here is a sort of quasi-sui, which respects its own political and moral systems. Since no one has effective control or influence over the Communist Party from without, and since at any rate revolution itself tends to relativize all previous values, the Communist Party can easily come to jeopardize certain previously accumulated objective universal human values and consequently become morally unscrupulous. The party is soon confronted with the problem of how to avoid ethical pessimism without falling prey to unreasonable and naive ethical optimism. But in invoking the danger of naive optimism, the party merely attempts to rationalize the party's permanent social monopoly, the party's complete lack of trust towards other members of society, as well as the party's boundless self-confidence and arrogance. This fateful choice between further monopolization and gradual demonopolization is imposed upon the party relatively soon after it comes to power. As I have repeatedly stated above, this question involves nothing other than the epochal dilemma, statism or socialism. The revolutionary organization cannot rely solely upon the revolutionary organization's moral political potential for long. The social solution lies in emancipating the other socialist forces in society, above all the working class, so that they may influence, correct, and control the revolutionary organization. In short, consistent and continuous democratization. Instead of being stifled, the dialectical relationship between the revolutionary vanguard and the people, and above all the working class, must be consciously permitted to operate freely. Otherwise, the revolutionary organization will become one of the principal stumbling blocks to socialism, and what is more, the creator of a new class, oligarchic statist system. Although it aspires to liberate mankind, the revolutionary organization can quickly enslave both its own members and society as a whole. This choice between monopolization and democratization polarizes people, particularly those who hold social power. This dilemma and this dilemma's consequences go a long way toward explaining the ethical tragedy of part of the communist movement. Revolution is usually accompanied by an eruption of unlimited hope. It is precisely for this reason that when these hopes are forsaken, there is an eruption of extreme disillusionment, bitterness, and pessimism. Once having observed signs of their own movement's degeneration, many revolutionaries ask themselves in complete bewilderment, how, why, and when did it start? Of course, it starts the same way as with many other noble revolutionary groups of the past. With the seizure of power anew, particular interests come to the fore, interests which make their influence felt upon the totality of revolutionary consciousness. Previously unrecognized possibilities and goals have begun to appear. Victory comes when the revolutionary organization is transformed into a state apparatus. Thus there is an immediate danger that the revolutionaries will abdicate in favor of people interested in the possession of power pure and simple. The expression, quote, power corrupts, unquote, reflects the profound wisdom and experience of the people. If it selects the course of further monopolization of social life, the Revolutionary Party is soon infected by dangerous viruses, two of which are careerism and privilege. The Revolutionary Party, transformed into the ruling party, attracts swarms of careerists to its ranks, for while the party must acquire a mass membership in order to avoid sectarianism, the party opens its door to careerists in so doing. In peaceful time, careerists can satisfy the party's criterion of political activism just as well as anyone else. But the careerists' true motivations for joining and working for the party are not so easily seen and evaluated. Experience shows that, quote, purges not only are of no avail in the struggle against careerism, but that on the contrary they lead to the negative selection of members, making it possible for the careerists to drive the party's honest members from its ranks. All other similar measures aimed against careerism are only palliatives, as they do not penetrate to the root of careerism, which is the party's monopolistic position in society. So long as it remains in such a position, the party is essentially powerless to solve the ethical paradox that people should enter an organization which occupies a completely privileged social position solely for the sake of its humanistic ideals. So long as it remains in such a position, the party is essentially powerless to solve the ethical paradox that people should enter an organization which occupies a completely privileged social position solely for the sake of its humanistic ideals. The party will cease being attractive to careerists only when entry into the party involves nothing but greater obligations. Upon seizing power, one segment of the movement's adherents begin to live off the revolution instead of living for the revolution as they had previously done. Their appeal to self-sacrifice or revolutionary ideals gradually ceases to regulate their own behavior. Indeed, as Adler says, quote, it is easier to struggle for principles than to live according to principles, end quote. Concern for revolutionary cages becomes a mere pretext for privilege. One can easily cross the boundary between the moral use and abuse of power without noticing it. Succumbing to such a temptation only proves that envy was all along the substantive and motivational element, probably unconscious in the struggle against the rich and the powerful. True, it is not easy to resist the lures of privilege, but on the other hand, the very same people pretend to ideological political vanguardism, which is inconceivable without moral exemplariness. They usually attempt to justify their position by claiming that the sum total of the privileges earned by such worthy people is only a, quote, trifle as compared to the national income. First of all, however, all privilege in a backward country seems many times greater psychologically than in a wealthier country, and secondly, these privileges are hardly, quote, trifles in a moral political sense. After all, material privileges only reflect a generally privileged position in society. It is curious that it is often precisely these privileged people who put themselves in charge of the struggle, abstract, of course, against privilege. They hypocritically recommend that critics stop pointing fingers at the privileged, suggesting that they replace their, quote, moralistic critique with a critique of the system which makes privilege possible. As if these tasks were mutually exclusive and criticism of the privileged were not an aspect of a concrete critique of the system. When such, quote, theoretical advice proves to be of no avail, criticism is then silenced by means of administrative measures. Instead of measures being taken against the privileged, they are taken against their critics. This is a consequence of the, quote, power of the critics and the, quote, powerlessness of the privileged. Still, we ought to recognize that socio-historical circumstances strongly favored choice of the monopolistic alternative which led to the moral perversion of the vanguard. Confronted with a difficult situation demanding a far-reaching historical choice, the vanguard's moral strength becomes all the more important, and its potential merit all the greater. On the other hand, the difficulty of the situation cannot diminish the vanguard's responsibility, should the vanguard opt for the monopolistic solution, as its course of action depends primarily upon its own qualities. After all, the revolutionary organization has also monopolized the historical moral right to lead society, and thus the entire burden of historical moral responsibility at this historical juncture likewise falls upon the revolutionary organization's shoulders. The greater the movement's pretensions, the more severe should be the criterion used to evaluate the movement's achievements. The vanguard exhibits the greatest degree of ethical consciousness and merit when the vanguard begins to draw the broad masses into the process of assuming social responsibility. The situation within the world communist movement had made it particularly difficult to choose a truly revolutionary course of action. In the guise of solidarity and internationalism, the communist movement was subordinated to a single national movement. Thus, the other national movements lost or never had a chance to achieve the extraordinary ethical values of freedom, autonomy, and equality. An extraordinary degree of moral strength is necessary in 1948 to say, quote, no, for the sake of dignity, at the risk of isolation, rejection, and uncertainty. The Yugoslav communist moral historical merit is all the greater for this. It is even more impressive when we consider the chain reaction of consequences set in motion by this first breakthrough, as well as the tragic division which these communists had to overcome within their own ranks. As a devotee of physical force, Stalin was destined to overlook in his calculations precisely this extraordinary moral strength on the part of the Yugoslav communists. The basic meaning of the revolutionary organization is to realize the revolutionary organization's humanistic program. It is self-critical in practice to the extent that it ensures effective supervision of this function. To be a revolutionary organization is not simply to be committed to defined historical goals. To be a revolutionary organization is also to continuously adjust the organization's action and the organization's structure to those goals. Stalinists do exactly the reverse, looking upon organization as some sort of metaphysical entity. Because of the difficulties encountered by the revolutionary organization in its formation and attempt to seize power, and subsequently because the great length of the period for which it rules society, it is in constant danger of being transformed into an end in itself, and ultimately into a means for inhuman goals. In such circumstances, concern for the organization itself imperceptibly replaces the organization's goals. The paradox of organization, as one form of the paradox means, can be described in the following terms. In order to struggle effectively for humanistic goals in conditions of illegality, revolutionaries must create a totally centralized, hierarchical, and largely undemocratic organization, and once they achieve this, the organization tends to become finalized, thereby jeopardizing the organization's proclaimed goals. And I'm going to repeat that because it was in italics. The paradox of organization, as one form of the paradox of means, can be described in the following terms. In order to struggle effectively for humanistic goals in conditions of illegality, revolutionaries must create a totally centralized, hierarchical, and largely undemocratic organization, and once they achieve this, the organization tends to become finalized, thereby jeopardizing the organization's proclaimed goals. To make things even more grotesque, such parties often carry out, quote, reorganizations, end quote. But these reorganizations only remain within the vicious circle of altering the organizational scheme without bringing the above-mentioned principles of organization and action themselves into question. Analysis of the process of finalization should not rest content with considering the revolutionary organization as a whole. Actually, it is the leading hierarchy which is finalized, while the membership becomes its mere instrument. The organization becomes differentiated between those who have power, privilege, and prestige, and the, quote, ordinary members. The party apparatus employs force as well as ideological and political means in order to preserve this differentiation, as it is the bearer of state power. The ultimate result is thus paradoxical. While the revolutionaries voluntarily associated themselves in order to fight for de-alienation, the revolutionary organization becomes alienated from the revolutionaries and becomes a source of new forms of alienation in society at large. The ultimate result is thus paradoxical. While the revolutionaries voluntarily associated themselves in order to fight for de-alienation, the revolutionary organization becomes alienated from them and becomes a source of new forms of alienation in society at large. This brings to mind Mephistopheles' words to the newly initiated Faust, quote, "Free at your first step, at the second a slave," end quote. After the seizure of power, the moment quickly arrives when the emphasis should be no longer solely on organization, but on personality as well. While organization transcends the phenomenon of the powerless individualist, organization does not, in and of itself, provide any guarantees against obsession with organization. The only true cure for the phobia of organization that is characteristic of the selfish individualist is the principle of organization of personalities. Realization of this principle can prevent the emergence of organized impersonality. One of the principal difficulties confronting the task of preserving moral vanguardism, which certainly cannot be usurped but which rather must be constantly reassumed, is the relationship between loyalty to the organization, which in addition to its practical meaning also has the moral meaning of fulfilling a self-assumed duties in the struggle for the humanization of the world, and the moral integrity, dignity, independence, initiative, and freedom of its members. All these communist values can be put in jeopardy unless the revolutionary organization essentially democratizes itself. A movement is truly communist only to the extent that the movement contains elements of the proclaimed revolutionary goals within itself. The principle, quote, "I serve my party," end quote, is dangerous because of its ambiguity. Ultimately, the members should serve not the party, but rather the revolutionary goals for which active participation in the task of defining, concretizing, and controlling the party's policies are necessary. These goals certainly include the creation of a free, autonomous, and dignified personality. A subordinated, dependent, and degraded person can only try to give the impression of fighting for the realization of these goals. In History and Class Consciousness, Lukács wrote that the communist organization imposes great demands upon the communist organization's members, and that it is therefore a higher form of organization than either bourgeois parties or opportunistic workers' parties. I would say that this is only part of the truth. If practice were to end here, the consequences could be disastrous. Actually, a communist organization should be distinguished not only in what the communist organization demands of the communist organization's members, but also in what the communist organization's members demand of the communist organization. When party life is increasingly monopolized, quote, ordinary, quote, end quote, members become morally and politically irresponsible, throwing the entire burden of responsibility onto the shoulders of the hierarchy and the leadership. In such circumstances, the organization becomes the vehicle of absolute truth, including truth of a moral nature, both for its ordinary and, quote, members or for society as a whole. This kind of an organization, seeing its embodiment in its leadership, imagines that it possesses absolute knowledge of historical necessity. What qualities other than megalomania, vanity, and intolerance can this kind of party leadership exhibit? It would follow that such an organization is infallible, while only its individual members make mistakes. The assumed infallibility of the organization is transformed into the alleged infallibility of the leadership, which, though not made explicit, is implicit in its behavior. Real criticism of the leadership in this kind of an organization, either public criticism or criticism confined to the organization itself, is impossible. Since such an organization, i.e. that an organization's leadership, is infallible, the legitimacy of any possible conflict between the conscience and loyalty of the organization is never conceded. Furthermore, the organization's subjectivism is, as a rule, rationalized as objectivism. When a policy reversal must be made, the previous line is declared to have been objectively necessary in the conditions which prevailed at the time. But this is true only if the party's previous decisions are seen as substantive elements of those conditions. Thus, the party's apparent objectivism is discovered only to have concealed the party's real subjectivism. The party's apparent objectivism is discovered only to have concealed the party's real subjectivism. Even when the party explicitly recognizes that it has made a mistake, this kind of organization never says who was right. Usually it does not even admit that anyone was right at all. Thus it happens that, quote, ordinary members are held to be morally and politically irresponsible if they anticipate the need to correct the organization's, i.e. the leadership's policy, before it has been done by the leadership. The leadership's reaction to such an action usually manifests more uneasiness and spitefulness than it would in the case of a hostile attack. Such people are never admitted to have been right, not even when it has been proven that they were. While their ideas are usually appropriate in practice, they remain censored nonetheless. However, a really thorough moral self-critical posture simultaneously involves recognition of those who were right. Perhaps the moral nature of Stalinism is best manifested in Stalinism's attitude toward revolutionary violence. The ethical basis of armed socialist revolution is the fact that violence is at times the only alternative to a violent world. To that extent, the revolutionary has not only the moral right, but the moral duty to use violence, so long as it represents violence over violence, and so long as it really serves humanistic ends. The revolution does not come into conflict with ethics. The difference between Marxist and non-Marxist humanism is particularly striking when revolutionary violence is considered. All Marxists see such violence as justified in certain circumstances, while many representatives of non-Marxist humanism, invoking the principle of the sanctity of human life, do not recognize the validity of revolutionary violence in any conditions whatsoever. But this variety of humanism, however noble in its intentions, objectively represents the toleration of evil, which uses force, as it does not permit the oppressed to use force against evil. Besides, a humanist living in a highly developed country with democratic traditions may find it difficult to empathize with people who are fighting for humanism in conditions of poverty and despotism. A humanism which in principle excludes the use of revolutionary violence is simply irrelevant to such situations. However, neither can we accept the unrestricted discourse to revolutionary violence defended by some Marxists. Desiring to avoid the difficulties of their position, they proceed from the fact that revolutionary violence will be applied anyway and conclude that whether it is ethically justified or not is a matter of little importance. This is of course inaccurate, since what revolutionaries do in the course of the revolution leaves deep tracks upon the revolutionaries and largely defines the revolutionaries' behavior after the revolutionaries come to power. The consistent revolutionary must continuously ask himself whether violence really provides the conditions for the realization of revolutionary humanistic goals. Upon closer analysis, this question subdivides into the following parts. 1. Does the revolutionary attempt to restrict the use and extent of violence to the absolutely indispensable? Is he aware that violence always creates moral pitfalls for the revolution, no matter how carefully it is applied, and how necessary it is to clearing away obstacles to the humanization of society? And 3. Against whom is violence to be used? In the absence of such self-control, revolutionary violence often becomes sadistic cruelty. Someone who once put it well, saying, quote, "The transition from a less extreme to a more extreme form of violence is imperceptible, but after that it is extremely difficult to take a step backwards." End quote. Unfortunately, the sum total of violence used by the revolution is usually disproportionate to the situation, i.e., quote, surplus violence, end quote. Many innocent heads roll as a consequence of this hypertrophy of violence, yet generosity should be a permanent quality of every true revolutionary. Every true revolutionary should know that it is better for many guilty people to escape revolutionary justice than for one innocent person to perish at its hands. At times one even finds that, under the camouflage of revolutionary violence, personal feuding and ruthlessness are running havoc. Revolutionary violence becomes the most common form of tyranny when revolutionaries overlook the fact that violence can only eliminate obstacles, but cannot itself yield more positive solutions. In response to Kautsky's critique of the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin once wrote, quote, "Dictatorship is rule based directly upon force, unrestricted by any laws. The revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat is rule won and maintained by the use of violence by the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, rule that is unrestricted by any laws," end quote. Lenin. But this may be only part of the truth. Revolutionary power, that is to say, should bind its hands with laws and independent courts as soon as possible, precisely in its own humanistic interests. Revolutionary power is, of course, illegal with respect to the previous legal systems, but it does not at all follow that law itself is a creation of the bourgeoisie, or that revolution does not immediately need to establish legal boundaries to its own arbitrariness. On the contrary, it will be threatened by its own voluntarism more than by all counter-revolutionaries taken together. Stalinism makes a caricature of legality, seeing it only as a defense of the state from the citizens, rather than of the citizens from the state. Trotsky's response to Kautsky's terrorism and communism of 1919. I have like half that piece up there. I don't know if I have the other half of it on my Google Drive, but for some reason I only have half of it up. But I definitely read the whole thing. Anyway, Trotsky's response to Kautsky's, I'm talking about Kautsky's terrorism and communism 1919 that I have on the channel, is an excellent example of how a great revolutionary may act without moral sensitivity to the problems of revolution. Kautsky had criticized the Bolsheviks for taking mass hostages and constructing mass executions and punitive expeditions, even though these acts were in response to similar acts of counter-revolution. Still, his ultimate conclusion was unacceptable. Proceeding from the principle of the sanctity of human life, Kautsky actually reproached the Bolsheviks with having carried out the revolution without considering Russia's backwardness. In his reply of 1920, Trotsky, instead of concentrating upon an ethical justification of the net balance of the revolution, tried to justify its every action and thus, in my opinion, exhibited a lack of sensitivity to the ethical delicacy of revolutionary violence. Trotsky's counter-accusations of, quote, Kantian preaching and, quote, Quaker babble about the sanctity of life, and, quote, did not, of course, remove the problems and dilemmas which Kautsky had raised. As illustration, I shall quote some typical passages from Trotsky, quote, the revolution does require of the revolutionary class that it should attain its end by all methods at its disposal, unquote. Trotsky. Quote, the question of the form of repression, of repression's degree, of course, is not one of, quote, principle, is a question of expediency, end quote. Trotsky, Terrorism and Communism. The following lines show how superficially and transparently Trotsky wrote about the difference between, quote, white and, quote, red terror. Quote, terror is helpless, and then only in, quote, the long run, end quote, if it is employed against a historically rising class. But terror can be very efficient against a reactionary class which does not want to leave the scene of operations, end quote. Trotsky. Nearly 2 decades later, Trotsky exhibited the same weaknesses in his article Their Morals and Ours, which was justly criticized by the American philosopher John Dewey. Here Trotsky facilely rejected charges of a certain degree of moral unscrupulousness in the revolution, asserting that, quote, revolution is a product of class society and necessarily possesses class society's features, end quote. Trotsky. For Trotsky, morality was completely class relative and thus contained no universal human elements to morally obligate the revolution in any way. True, Trotsky also wrote that revolutions are permitted only those means whose use leads to the emancipation of mankind. But Trotsky exhibited an extreme lack of moral discrimination in dealing with correct means, even the most extreme means, neglecting to ask if they had, in fact, contributed to the emancipation of mankind. While violence can only have an exclusively instrumental value for the true revolutionary, and that only under defined conditions, the Stalinist largely transforms violence into an end in itself, and ultimately into a means to counter-revolutionary ends. Although he invokes Marx's reception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Stalin is obviously closer to Sorel's teaching on violence. As well known in his reflections on violence, George Sorel advocated ethical unscrupulousness in the class struggle. In Sorel's view, violence in the class struggle, by analogy with violence in war, should be looked upon solely from the standpoint of strategic calculation and efficacy in bringing about the total defeat of the enemy. Sorel wrote, quote, it is precisely to violence that socialism is indebted for its high moral values, through which it shall bring salvation to the modern world, end quote. Sorel. Actually, the socialist movement is indebted to anything but violence for its moral values. Violence may merely help it to seize power and nothing more. Under the pretext of the sharpening of the class struggle under socialism, the Stalinists persistently expanded the use of terror. But even had this pretext been valid, the fact would still have remained that revolutionary dictatorship is not the same as the physical annihilation of the members of the dispossessed class. The first symptoms of the pathological condition of the revolution is the transformation of class struggle, the goal of which is to end the class in the sociological sense into human massacre. And there was definitely a degree to which Lenin, for instance, uses terms like extermination about in reference to the bourgeoisie. The next step is certain to be terror against the classes allied to the proletariat. And indeed, the bloody collectivization of agriculture proved that the Stalinists were much more anxious about effecting a change in land ownership than about the lives of millions of peasants. The Stalinists' second pretext for intensifying the use of terror was the ruthlessness of the enemies of the revolution. For instance, at first the Bolsheviks had abolished capital punishment, but they were later compelled to reintroduce it because of counter-revolutionary terror. This was not a very convincing justification, rather than counter-revolutionaries who were later victims of the Stalinist terror. When a communist response is in kind to the enemy's sadistic brutality, how are we to distinguish one from the other? Red terror, which reacts in this manner against white terror, imperceptibly changes its own color in the process, despite its proclaimed socialist goals. The Stalinist stands morally condemned on the basis of each of the three criteria which we enumerated earlier. The Stalinist uses violence immoderately, without any moral scruple, and against the Stalinist's own comrades in arms. In the Stalinist hands, revolutionary violence becomes violence against the revolution. Permanent revolution, in the sense of increasingly resolute efforts to realize revolutionary humanistic ends, is replaced by permanent terror. The pathology of revolutionary violence must be given much more serious attention than it has received in the past. Under Stalinism, revolutionary violence was perverted and transformed into universal paranoid mistrust. Social paranoia, the madness of violence, even greater paranoia, even greater destruction, this vicious circle was constantly retracted. The pathology of revolutionary violence vividly reflects the entire Stalinist pathology of the revolution. When people lose their respect for human life, and most of all for the lives of their own comrades, what then will they respect? Okay, so that's the end of section 9 of Svetozar Stojanović's Between Ideals and Reality, a Critique of Socialism and Its Future. Thank you so much for listening.